What if I told you that you're already in prison? Not behind bars, not in chains, but trapped nonetheless. You work, you pay taxes, you follow the rules, and somehow you never get ahead. Meanwhile, your government borrows trillions, spends trillions, and tells you everything is fine, but here's what they're not telling you: that debt isn't a mistake. It's not incompetence, it's not poor planning. It's a trap, designed specifically for you. Every dollar your government borrows is a claim on your future labor, on your children's labor, on generations not yet born. And the beautiful part? You never agreed to it, you never signed anything, but you'll spend your entire life paying it back. Through taxes, through inflation, through a system rigged to extract wealth from workers and transfer it to the already wealthy. This is generational theft on a scale never seen in human history. The United States national debt is over $35 trillion. That's $104,000 for every single American. Every man, woman, and child. Did you borrow that money? Did you spend it? Did you agree to be responsible for it? No, but you'll pay one way or another. And the people who created this system, they're profiting from it, massively. Banks collect interest on government debt. The wealthy buy government bonds as safe investments. The politically connected get contracts and bailouts. And you get the bill. This is the money upside down. And today you're going to learn how debt became the most powerful weapon ever created to control populations, extract wealth, and ensure you never escape the system. Let's start with a simple question. Why do governments borrow money? If you or I spend more than we earn, we go bankrupt. We lose our house, our car, our assets are seized. We face consequences. But governments can spend beyond their means for decades, sometimes centuries, without immediate consequences. How? Through sovereign debt. The ability to borrow against future tax revenue. This concept isn't new. Governments have been borrowing money for thousands of years. Ancient Greek city-states borrowed from temples. Roman emperors borrowed from wealthy citizens. Medieval kings borrowed from merchants and banking families. But here's the critical difference between ancient debt and modern debt. Ancient rulers borrowed as individuals. If a king borrowed money and couldn't repay, the king faced consequences. Creditors could refuse future loans. They could fund rival claimants to the throne. They could even go to war to collect. The debt was personal. Modern government debt is impersonal. It's not the politician who borrowed the money who pays it back. It's you, the taxpayer. And not just current taxpayers, future taxpayers who weren't even born when the debt was created. This fundamentally changed the incentive structure. Ancient kings had reasons to be cautious with debt because they might personally face consequences. Modern politicians have every incentive to borrow massively because they get the political benefits of spending now, and someone else deals with repayment later. The modern system of government debt really began in the 17th century. The key innovation came from England in 1694 with the creation of the Bank of England. Here's how it worked. England was at war with France. Wars are expensive. King William III needed money, but couldn't raise enough through taxes. The people were already heavily taxed and on the verge of rebellion. He couldn't just debase the currency like Roman emperors, because England was trying to maintain a gold and silver standard. So a group of wealthy merchants made him an offer. They would lend the government £1.2 million, an enormous sum at the time. In exchange, they would receive a royal charter to form the Bank of England. This bank would have the exclusive right to issue banknotes backed by government debt. Read that again. The bank would issue currency backed by the government's promise to pay. The government's debt became the foundation of the money supply. This was genius, diabolical genius. The government could now borrow unlimited amounts, and that borrowed money would literally become the currency everyone used. The more the government borrowed, the more money entered circulation. Debt and money became the same thing. And who profited? The Bank of England's shareholders, the same wealthy merchants who lent the initial money. They collected interest on the government debt. They controlled the money supply. They became the most powerful financial institution in the world. Other countries watched and copied the model. The Banque de France in 1800, the Federal Reserve in the United States in 1913, central banks around the world, all operating on the same principle. Government debt as the basis for money creation. But let's focus on the implications. Before this system, money was primarily gold and silver, commodities with intrinsic value. The money supply was limited by how much gold and silver existed. Governments couldn't just create money, they had to mine it or acquire it through trade. After this system, money became debt, specifically government debt. To create new money, the government had to borrow it into existence. And every unit of currency created represented an obligation to pay it back with interest. This means the money supply is always smaller than the total debt. Think about it. If every dollar is borrowed into existence with interest, where does the money to pay the interest come from? It has to be borrowed too, which creates more interest, which requires more borrowing. It's a debt spiral built into the very foundation of the monetary system. The national debt can never be paid off in this system. It's not designed to be paid off. It's designed to grow forever. Because if the debt were actually paid off, the money supply would collapse. The entire economy would seize up. The system requires ever-increasing debt to function. Now, governments and economists will tell you this is fine. They'll say government debt isn't like household debt. They'll invoke modern monetary theory and claim governments that control their own currency can never go bankrupt. They'll say debt doesn't matter as long as the economy grows faster than the debt. This is a lie, or at best, a dangerous half-truth. Yes, governments that issue their own currency can't go bankrupt in the traditional sense. They can always print more money to pay debts denominated in that currency. But that's not a solution. That's inflation. That's currency debasement. That's the same thing Rome did, just with a printing press instead of a furnace. And yes, if the economy grows faster than the debt becomes more manageable as a percentage of GDP. But here's the problem. In the modern era, debt is growing much faster than the economy. In 1980, US national debt was about $900 billion, roughly 33% of GDP. Today it's over $35 trillion, over 120% of GDP. In 40 years, the debt grew by a factor of 38, while the economy only grew by a factor of 7. The debt is growing exponentially faster than the economy. And it's not just the United States. Japan's debt is over 260% of GDP. Greece nearly collapsed under debt exceeding 200% of GDP. Italy, Spain, France, all carrying debt loads that would have been considered catastrophic a generation ago. Why? Because politicians face the same incentives Roman emperors faced. Spending wins elections. Cutting spending loses elections. Promising benefits wins votes. Raising taxes loses votes. So they spend, promise, and borrow. The consequences come later, after they're out of office. But the consequences do come, and you're living through them right now. Every dollar the government borrows dilutes the value of every dollar you hold. Because that borrowed money enters the economy, increases the money supply, and drives inflation. Your savings lose purchasing power. Your wages buy less. Your standard of living declines. All while the government's debt gets easier to repay because they're paying it back with inflated currency. This is the debt trap. Not the government's trap, yours. The government benefits from debt. Banks benefit from debt. The wealthy who own government bonds benefit from debt. You don't. You pay for it through taxes and inflation while receiving none of the benefits, and the system is designed to make sure you can never escape. Let's get specific about how this trap actually works. Because the system is deliberately complex to hide what's really happening, when the government wants to spend money it doesn't have, it issues bonds. Treasury bonds, treasury notes, treasury bills. Different names for the same thing, government IOUs. These bonds promise to pay back the borrowed amount, plus interest over a specified period. Who buys these bonds? A few different groups. Foreign governments hold about 30% of US debt. China, Japan, and others park their dollars in US Treasury bonds. Private investors and institutions hold another chunk. Banks, pension funds, insurance companies. And the largest holder, the Federal Reserve itself, holding over 20% of the debt. Wait, the Federal Reserve? The central bank? How does that work? Here's where it gets interesting. When the Federal Reserve buys government bonds, it doesn't use tax revenue or savings. It creates new money electronically and uses that new money to buy the bonds. This process is called monetizing the debt, or more euphemistically, quantitative easing. Let's break down what actually happens. The US Treasury needs $1 trillion. It issues bonds. The Federal Reserve creates $1 trillion out of thin air, literally just updating numbers in a computer, and buys those bonds. The Treasury now has $1 trillion to spend. The Federal Reserve now holds $1 trillion in government bonds earning interest. This is money creation by debt. The government gets to spend money that didn't exist until that moment, and the national debt increases by $1 trillion. But here's the crucial part, that new money is now in the economy, chasing the same amount of goods and services. More money, same goods. That's inflation by design. The Federal Reserve will tell you they're managing the money supply, or stimulating the economy, or ensuring liquidity. What they're actually doing is enabling the government to spend far beyond tax revenue by printing money to buy government debt. This accelerated dramatically after 2008. Before the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, the total value of assets they held, was under $900 billion. After quantitative easing programs, it peaked over $9 trillion in 2022. That's $8 trillion created out of nothing and used to buy government debt and mortgage-backed securities. Where did that $8 trillion go? Some went to banks as reserves. Some went to the government through bond purchases. Some went to propping up asset prices. But all of it diluted the value of every dollar already in circulation. Your dollars, your savings, your wages. And who profited? Banks that held the assets the Fed purchased, Wall Street firms that benefited from asset price inflation, government contractors who got paid with newly created money, the wealthy who owned stocks, real estate, and bonds that increased in value as money flooded into financial markets. This is the Cantillon effect in action. New money doesn't enter the economy evenly. It enters at specific points: banks, government, financial markets, and the people closest to those entry points benefit first. They get to spend the new money before prices adjust. By the time that money trickles down to wages and reaches average workers, prices have already increased. The first receivers get richer, the last receivers get poorer. But the debt trap goes deeper than just inflation. Let's talk about how this system ensures you stay trapped. First, taxes. The government needs revenue to pay interest on the debt. In 2023, the US government paid over $650 billion just in interest on the national debt. Not paying down principal, just interest. That's more than the entire defense budget of most countries. Where does that $650 billion come from? Your taxes. A huge portion of federal tax revenue goes straight to bondholders as interest payments. You work, you pay taxes, and that money goes to wealthy individuals, banks, and foreign governments who own treasury bonds. You're working to pay interest to the already wealthy. It's a transfer of wealth from workers to capital owners, facilitated by government debt. Second, inflation. When the government can't or won't raise taxes enough to cover spending and interest payments, they monetize more debt. The Fed creates more money. Inflation increases. Your purchasing power declines. This is a hidden tax that doesn't require legislation or approval. It just happens, silently eroding your wealth. And here's the insidious part. Inflation benefits debtors at the expense of savers. The government is the biggest debtor in the world. They benefit massively from inflation because they pay back debt with currency that's worth less than when they borrowed it. But you? If you're a saver, you're destroyed. If you're on a fixed income, you're destroyed. If you're a worker whose wages don't keep up with real inflation, you're destroyed. Third, the debt ceiling theater. Every few years, the US has a debt ceiling crisis, where Congress debates whether to raise the limit on how much the government can borrow. The media covers it breathlessly. Politicians give grave speeches about fiscal responsibility. And then they raise the ceiling. They always raise the ceiling. Because the alternative, actually defaulting on debt or cutting spending to match revenue, is politically impossible. So the ceiling gets raised, the debt grows, and the cycle continues. This theater exists to give the illusion of restraint while ensuring nothing actually changes. It's a show to make you think someone is being responsible with your money. They're not. Fourth, the impossibility of escape. Even if you personally avoid debt, even if you save diligently and live below your means, you can't escape the system. Because the government's debt becomes your burden through taxes and inflation, whether you participated in the borrowing or not. You're forced to subsidize others' consumption. The government borrows to fund welfare programs, corporate subsidies, military spending, infrastructure projects. Some of this might benefit you, but much of it doesn't. Yet you pay for all of it. And when things go wrong, when banks make risky bets and fail, when corporations over-leverage and collapse, when financial crises hit, the government borrows more to bail them out. Trillions in bailouts for banks in 2008, trillions in COVID stimulus, trillions for every crisis, every war, every disaster. The debt grows, your obligation grows, but you never consented to any of it. This is why it's called a trap. You can't vote your way out because both major parties support deficit spending. You can't opt out because taxes are mandatory and inflation affects everyone. You can't escape by saving because inflation erodes savings. You can't escape by working harder because taxes and inflation take more as you earn more. The system is designed to extract wealth from labor and transfer it to capital. Government debt is the mechanism that makes this extraction possible on a massive, sustained scale. And it's getting worse. Interest rates stayed artificially low for over a decade after 2008. This allowed governments to borrow massive amounts while keeping interest payments manageable. But rates have risen. The same debt now costs much more to service. The US government is now spending more on interest payments than on many entire cabinet departments. As rates rise and debt grows, interest payments will consume an ever larger share of the budget. Eventually, the government will face a choice: default on the debt, which would collapse the financial system, or monetize the debt massively, which means hyperinflation. Neither option is good for you. Either way, you lose. Some economists argue this can continue indefinitely as long as the economy grows. But they're ignoring history. Every government that tried to sustain unlimited debt eventually faced crisis. Weimar Germany, Argentina, Greece, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. The mechanism might differ, but the result is always the same: currency crisis, economic collapse, social chaos. The United States has avoided this so far because the dollar is the world reserve currency. Other countries need dollars for international trade, especially oil. This creates artificial demand for dollars and treasury bonds, allowing the US to borrow far more than would otherwise be possible. But that status is not permanent. China and Russia are working to bypass the dollar in trade. The BRICS nations are exploring alternative reserve currencies. Digital currencies and blockchain technology could undermine dollar dominance. When the world no longer needs to hold dollars, demand for treasury bonds will collapse, interest rates will spike, and the debt trap will spring shut. You're living in the endgame of the greatest debt bubble in human history, and when it bursts, it won't be the politicians who borrowed the money or the banks who enabled it who suffer. It'll be you. Now let's talk about who actually benefits from this system. Because it's not you, and it's not accidental. The government debt system creates enormous wealth for a specific class of people, and understanding who they are and how they profit is essential to understanding why the system never changes. First, banks and financial institutions. They are the primary dealers in government debt. When the Treasury issues bonds, a select group of banks, currently 24 institutions designated as primary dealers, are required to bid on them. These banks then sell these bonds to other investors, taking a cut on every transaction. But the real profit comes from the Federal Reserve's operations. When the Fed conducts quantitative easing, buying bonds to inject money into the economy, who do they buy from? The primary dealer banks. So the process works like this. Treasury issues bonds, primary dealers buy them, Federal Reserve buys them from the primary dealers at a profit for the dealers. The banks make money on every step. They're essentially middlemen between the government and the central bank, extracting profit from the debt issuance process. And because this happens in the billions and trillions, the profits are staggering. JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, Bank of America. These institutions make enormous sums facilitating government debt. They're not taking risk. They're not creating value. They're skimming profit from the money creation process. Second, the wealthy and institutional investors. Government bonds are considered the safest investment available. Why? Because the government can always tax or inflate to make payments. default risk is minimal for major economies. This makes treasury bonds perfect for wealthy individuals, pension funds, insurance companies, and foreign governments looking for safe returns. They buy hundreds of billions in bonds, collect interest paid by your tax dollars, and sleep soundly knowing the government will always pay. The interest might seem small, 3%, 4%, 5% depending on the bond duration and market conditions. But on billions of dollars, even small percentages are massive returns, and it's passive income, no work required, just collecting checks paid by taxpayers. Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway has held tens of billions in treasury bills. Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, every major institutional investor, they all hold significant treasury bond positions. It's free money, backed by your obligation to pay taxes. Third, government contractors and connected corporations. When the government borrows money, what does it spend it on? Defense contractors, infrastructure companies, healthcare corporations, technology firms with government contracts, consulting firms, and thousands of other businesses that feed at the government trough. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman. These defense contractors receive hundreds of billions in government contracts. Where does that money come from? Borrowed money, your future tax obligations. But it's not just obvious contractors. Pharmaceutical companies benefit from Medicare and Medicaid spending. Construction firms benefit from infrastructure bills. Tech companies from government IT contracts. Consulting firms from bureaucratic bloat. Agricultural corporations from farm subsidies. A huge portion of corporate America's revenue comes from government spending. And because the government funds that spending through debt, these corporations are essentially profiting from your obligation to repay that debt with interest. Fourth, foreign governments. China holds over $800 billion in US Treasury bonds. Japan holds over $1 trillion. These holdings give them leverage over US policy and provide safe returns on their dollar reserves. But think about what this means. American taxpayers are paying interest to foreign governments. Chinese and Japanese bondholders collect billions annually in interest paid by your taxes. This is a direct wealth transfer from American workers to foreign governments. Why do foreign governments hold this debt? Because international trade, especially in oil, is denominated in dollars. Countries need dollar reserves to conduct trade. US Treasury bonds are how they store those dollars while earning interest. This is one of the hidden benefits of dollar reserve currency status. The US can borrow from foreign governments at low interest rates. But it also means foreign governments are creditors, and creditors have power. The more they hold, the more leverage they have over US policy. Fifth, the political class. Politicians benefit enormously from the ability to borrow and spend without immediate consequences. They can fund pet projects in their districts. They can create programs that buy votes. They can hand out subsidies to favored industries, all without raising taxes, which is politically toxic. The average member of Congress oversees billions in spending for their district. They bring home federal money for roads, bridges, military bases, research facilities. They take credit for all this spending. They get re-elected based on bringing home the bacon. But that bacon is borrowed. It's debt that taxpayers will repay for decades. The politician gets the credit now and faces no consequences later. By the time the debt needs to be repaid, they're either out of office or can blame someone else. This creates a fundamental incentive problem. Politicians who advocate for fiscal responsibility get attacked for wanting to cut popular programs. Politicians who spend freely get praised for investing in the future. The entire incentive structure rewards borrowing and punishes restraint. And the revolving door between government and finance ensures this system persists. Treasury officials come from Wall Street banks and return to Wall Street after government service. Federal Reserve governors have close ties to the financial industry. Regulators are captured by the entities they're supposed to regulate. Former Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner worked for the private equity firm Warburg Pincus after leaving government. Former Fed Chair Janet Yellen received hundreds of thousands in speaking fees from financial institutions before becoming Treasury Secretary again. These aren't coincidences. This is a class of people moving between government and finance, ensuring the system that benefits them continues. Now let's contrast this with who doesn't benefit: you. Workers paid in wages see their purchasing power eroded by inflation driven by debt monetization. Savers see their savings lose value at rates exceeding interest earned. Small business owners struggle with economic uncertainty and tax burdens. Middle-class families find it harder each year to afford housing, education, healthcare. Young people are born into a system with over $100,000 in national debt per capita. They didn't borrow it, they didn't spend it, but they'll spend their entire working lives paying it back through taxes and inflation. Retirees on fixed incomes watch their pensions lose purchasing power. Social Security benefits, while adjusted for inflation, use government inflation statistics that dramatically understate real inflation. So benefits rise 3% while actual costs rise 8%, slowly impoverishing recipients. This is a wealth transfer system, from workers to capital owners, from young to old, from future generations to present beneficiaries, from productive sectors to politically connected sectors. And it's protected by complexity and propaganda. The system is deliberately complicated so most people don't understand it. Economists use jargon and sophisticated arguments to make it seem like expert management rather than systematic theft. Politicians from both parties support the system while pretending to oppose each other on details. The media, largely owned by corporations that benefit from government spending, doesn't question the fundamentals. They'll debate whether to spend $3 trillion or $4 trillion, but never whether spending far beyond revenue is sustainable. They'll discuss which programs to fund, but never whether the entire debt-based monetary system is designed to extract wealth from workers. You're not supposed to understand this. You're supposed to work, pay taxes, accept inflation, and believe the experts know what they're doing. You're supposed to think government debt is complex economic policy, not a mechanism for systematic wealth extraction. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every tax payment you make that goes to interest on debt, every price increase driven by monetary expansion, every bailout of banks and corporations funded by borrowing, every trillion added to the debt that you'll be obligated to repay, it's not a bug, it's a feature. The system works exactly as designed. The question is, who was it designed to benefit, not you? The debt trap isn't just an American problem, it's global, and it's reaching a breaking point. Global debt, government, corporate, and household combined, exceeded $300 trillion in 2023. That's more than 3 times global GDP. The entire economic output of every country on Earth for 3 years wouldn't be enough to pay off existing debt. Think about that. Humanity has borrowed more than it can possibly repay. This didn't happen overnight. It's the culmination of decades of policy decisions, all pointing in the same direction. Borrow more. Worry about consequences later. After World War II, most developed nations had high debt from war spending, but they also had growing economies, young populations, and limited social welfare systems. Debt as a percentage of GDP fell for decades as economies grew faster than debt. That changed in the 1970s and accelerated after 2008. Debt began growing faster than economic output. Why? Several factors converged. First, demographic aging. Western nations and Japan have aging populations. More retirees means more spending on pensions and healthcare, but fewer workers means less tax revenue. The math doesn't work. So governments borrowed to cover the gap. Second, financialization. Economies shifted from manufacturing to finance. Financial engineering created the illusion of growth while actual productive capacity stagnated. Banks became too big to fail, requiring government bailouts when their bets went wrong. Each bailout added to national debt. Third, globalization and competition. Manufacturing moved to countries with cheaper labor. This benefited corporations and consumers through lower prices, but devastated working-class communities in developed nations. Governments borrowed to fund social programs for displaced workers, attempting to maintain living standards despite declining real wages. Fourth, monetary policy. Central banks lowered interest rates to near zero and kept them there for over a decade. This made borrowing cheap for governments, corporations, and individuals. Everyone borrowed. Housing prices inflated into bubbles. Stock markets hit record highs. But it was all built on debt. And fifth, COVID-19. Governments worldwide borrowed trillions to fund lockdowns, business support, stimulus checks, and emergency programs. The US alone added over $5 trillion to national debt in 2 years. Other countries did the same proportionally. Now let's tour the crisis zones. Japan's government debt exceeds 260% of GDP, the highest in the developed world. For decades, Japan has borrowed to fund deficit spending, while the economy barely grew. The Bank of Japan has purchased so much government debt that it owns nearly half of all Japanese government bonds. This is debt monetization on a scale never before attempted by a major economy. The yen has lost significant value. Interest rates are controlled artificially low. The entire financial system is on life support, sustained only by central bank intervention. If the Bank of Japan stopped buying bonds, interest rates would spike, the government couldn't afford debt payments, and the system would collapse. They're trapped. They can't stop without triggering crisis, so they continue, knowing it's unsustainable but hoping to postpone the reckoning. Europe has multiple debt crises. Greece required multiple bailouts after its debt exceeded 200% of GDP and the government could not make payments. The solution? Other European countries and the IMF lent Greece money to pay existing creditors. They didn't reduce debt. They replaced one debt with another. Italy's debt exceeds 140% of GDP. Spain, Portugal, France, all carrying debt loads that would have triggered crises a generation ago. The European Central Bank holds this system together by purchasing government bonds from member countries. Without ECB intervention, interest rates would spike and multiple countries would face insolvency. China's total debt, government, corporate, and household, exceeds 300% of GDP. The government debt figure seems manageable at around 80% of GDP, but that excludes massive borrowing by local governments and state-owned enterprises. Include those, and the real picture is much worse. Chinese local governments have borrowed trillions using off-balance sheet vehicles. Real estate developers borrowed trillions, assuming property prices would rise forever. When the property bubble began deflating, developers defaulted. Evergrande, once China's largest developer, owes over $300 billion. Other developers face similar problems. China's government must choose: let defaults happen and trigger financial crisis, or bail out debtors and add to government debt. Either way, the day of reckoning approaches. Emerging markets face even worse situations. Argentina has defaulted on its debt 9 times in its history, most recently in 2020. The country cycles between borrowing, inflating, defaulting, and repeating. The Argentine peso has lost over 99% of its value against the dollar over decades. Lebanon's financial system collapsed in 2019. Banks froze accounts. The currency lost 90% of its value. Savings were wiped out. The government defaulted on debt. The crisis continues with no clear solution. Sri Lanka defaulted in 2022 after borrowing heavily from China for infrastructure projects that didn't generate enough economic return. The government couldn't make debt payments. The currency collapsed. Shortages of food and fuel triggered political chaos and the government's fall. These aren't isolated incidents. They're previews of what happens when debt becomes unsustainable. The crisis mechanisms differ. Sometimes default, sometimes inflation, sometimes both. But the outcome is always the same: economic devastation for ordinary people, while the connected elite escape with their wealth intact. Now, the argument from defenders of the current system is that developed countries with reserve currencies shan't have debt crises because they can print money to pay debts. This is technically true but misses the point. Yes, the US, Europe, and Japan can print money to avoid default, but printing money causes inflation. High enough inflation causes economic chaos just as surely as default would. The mechanism differs, but the destruction of wealth is the same. And there are limits even to money printing. When inflation gets high enough, people stop using the currency. They switch to foreign currencies, gold, barter, anything with more stable value. The currency loses its function as money. That's what happened in Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Weimar Germany. The belief that developed countries can print indefinitely without consequences is being tested in real time, and history suggests it won't end well. Central banks are trapped. They printed trillions to fight the 2008 crisis, and then printed trillions more for COVID. Now inflation is running hot. Their standard response would be raising interest rates to slow inflation. But raising rates makes government debt more expensive to service. The US government's interest payments have more than doubled as rates increased. If rates rise to historical averages of 5 to 6%, interest payments alone could exceed $1.5 trillion annually, consuming most tax revenue. The government would have to choose between servicing debt and funding programs. Japan faces even worse. If rates rise even modestly, the government couldn't afford interest payments on 260% of GDP in debt. The Bank of Japan must keep rates artificially suppressed forever, regardless of inflation consequences. This is financial repression, deliberately keeping interest rates below inflation to reduce debt burden at the expense of savers. It's a hidden wealth transfer from savers to debtors, primarily the government, and it's happening worldwide. Central banks are trapped between inflation and debt sustainability. Raise rates and debt becomes unpayable, keep rates low, and inflation destroys currency value. There's no good option. They chose this trap through decades of irresponsible policy. The global financial system is interconnected. Banks in each country hold debt from other countries. Sovereign wealth funds hold foreign bonds. When one major country has a debt crisis, it spreads. Greece's crisis threatened other European countries. A US default would trigger global financial collapse. A Chinese credit crisis would devastate commodity exporters worldwide. The system has become so interconnected that individual country problems become global contagion. This is why muddle through has been the policy response. Keep interest rates low, keep printing money, keep buying government bonds, keep the system functioning for one more day, one more quarter, one more year. No one wants to be in charge when it fails, so everyone kicks the can and hopes they're gone before catastrophe hits. But physics applies to economics. Exponential debt growth cannot continue indefinitely in a world of finite resources and real constraints. Something will break. The only questions are when and how. Will it be inflation, debt default, currency crisis, banking collapse, some combination? Different countries will experience different failure modes based on their specific circumstances. But the underlying cause will be the same. Unsustainable debt accumulated over decades by governments that spent beyond their means and central banks that enabled them by printing money. You're living through the largest debt bubble in human history. It's not a question of whether it will pop. It's a question of when. So what do you do? How do you protect yourself and your family when the entire global financial system is built on unsustainable debt? This is the individual's dilemma. You didn't create this mess. You don't have the power to fix it, but you'll suffer the consequences when it collapses. So how do you prepare? First, understand that traditional financial advice is based on the assumption of system stability. That advice doesn't work when the foundation is crumbling. The standard advice is, save money in a bank account, invest in a diversified portfolio of stocks and bonds, buy a house with a mortgage, contribute to a 401k, and trust that compound interest and long-term growth will secure your future. This advice made sense in a stable monetary system with sound fiscal policy. It doesn't make sense when governments are destroying currency through unlimited debt creation. Let's go through the problems with conventional advice in the current environment. Saving in a bank account. Banks pay interest of perhaps 1–3% on savings. Real inflation, actual cost increases in housing, food, energy, healthcare, education runs between 8 to 15% for most people. That means your savings loses 5 to 12% of purchasing power annually. You're getting poorer by saving. The bank uses your deposits to buy government bonds or make loans, earning 4 to 6%. They pay you 1 to 3% and keep the difference. You take all the inflation risk while they profit, and if the bank fails, FDIC insurance covers $250,000 per account. That sounds safe until you realize FDIC has nowhere near enough money to cover deposits if major banks fail. They'd have to borrow from the Treasury, which would print money, causing more inflation. Investing in stocks and bonds. Stocks have performed well over the last decade, primarily because central banks printed trillions, and that money flowed into financial assets. Stock prices rose not because companies became more productive, but because more money chased the same shares. This is asset price inflation. Your stocks might double in price, but if the currency loses half its value, you haven't gained wealth. You've stayed even. And when the debt bubble pops, asset prices crash. The people who get out early preserve wealth. Everyone else loses. Bonds are even worse. If you hold government bonds and the government inflates away debt, you get paid back in worthless currency. If you hold corporate bonds and corporations default during a crisis, you lose principal. Bonds made sense when inflation was low and stable. They're terrible investments in high inflation environments. Buying a house with a mortgage. This is complex. Real estate has historically been a good inflation hedge because property holds value while currency devalues, and mortgage debt benefits from inflation. You pay back the loan with cheaper money. But there are serious risks. Housing prices in many markets are in bubble territory, inflated by years of low interest rates and easy credit. When rates rise and credit tightens, housing markets can crash. People who bought at the peak lose equity or go underwater on their mortgages. Property taxes rise with inflation, increasing your carrying costs even if your mortgage payment is fixed. Maintenance and insurance costs rise. If you lose your job during an economic crisis, you can't pay the mortgage and the bank forecloses regardless of how much equity you thought you had. That said, owning your primary residence outright, no mortgage, is one of the best protections available. You have shelter regardless of economic conditions. No bank can take it for missed payments. Property taxes are a risk, but smaller than rent or mortgage payments. The key is location and affordability. Don't overextend. Don't buy at bubble prices assuming prices only go up. Buy in areas with strong fundamentals, jobs, infrastructure, reasonable taxes, not speculative markets driven by cheap credit. Contributing to a 401k or retirement account. These tax-advantaged accounts assume the system will still function in 20-30 years when you retire. They assume your dollars will have value. They assume markets will be accessible and functional. Maybe that's true. Maybe the system muddles through for decades more, but maybe it doesn't. If there's a currency crisis, those electronic account balances might not buy what you expect. If capital controls are imposed during a crisis, you might not be able to access funds. If the dollar loses reserve currency status, international purchasing power collapses. This doesn't mean avoid retirement accounts entirely, especially if there's an employer match. That's free money, but don't make them your only strategy. Diversify across different asset types and different jurisdictions if possible. So what should you do instead? There's no perfect answer, but here are principles for navigating an environment of unsustainable debt and monetary instability. Principle 1. Hold real assets, not financial assets. Real assets are things with intrinsic value independent of the financial system. Land, property, commodities, precious metals, tools, equipment, these hold value regardless of what happens to currency. Gold and silver have been money for thousands of years across every civilization. They can't be printed or inflated. Governments and central banks hold gold reserves precisely because it's the ultimate store of value. If you believe there's a risk of currency crisis, holding some physical precious metals is insurance, not gold ETFs or paper gold, physical metal you control. In a real crisis, paper claims might not be honored. Physical possession is what matters. Land is similar. They're not making more of it. It produces value through agriculture or resources or location. Own land with water rights if possible. Water may become more valuable than oil in coming decades. Principle 2. Reduce or eliminate debt. In an inflationary environment, debtors benefit and savers suffer. So conventional wisdom says, hold debt and let inflation erode it. But this only works if you have stable income to service the debt. In a crisis, income can disappear. Job losses spike, businesses fail. If you can't make payments, you lose the asset despite inflation helping in theory. Being debt-free provides flexibility and security that debt never can. The exception is fixed-rate mortgage debt on a property you can afford and won't lose even if times get hard. That debt gets cheaper with inflation while the property holds value. Principle 3. Develop skills and relationships that have value independent of money. In every collapse, people who could produce real goods and services, food, repair, medical care, construction, survived and often thrived. People whose wealth was purely financial were destroyed. Learn practical skills, build relationships in your community, be useful to others in ways that don't depend on a functioning financial system. This is insurance that can't be inflated away or defaulted on. Principle 4. Maintain liquidity and flexibility. Don't have all your wealth tied up in illiquid assets you can't access quickly. Keep some cash for immediate needs. Keep some assets you can sell if necessary. Don't lock everything in long-term investments or retirement accounts you can't touch without penalties. In a crisis, liquidity is survival. The people who weather storms are those who can adapt quickly, not those committed to rigid long-term plans. Principle 5. Understand the political economy. Your financial decisions don't happen in a vacuum. Government policy, tax law, regulations, these shape what's possible and profitable. Pay attention to what governments are doing with debt, spending, and monetary policy. When they're borrowing and printing aggressively, protect against inflation. When they're raising taxes on certain asset types, adjust accordingly. When they impose capital controls, have alternatives ready. This isn't about timing markets or getting rich. It's about not being destroyed by policy decisions made by people who don't have your interests in mind. Principle 6. Geographic diversification if possible. Don't keep all assets in one country or one currency. If you have the means, consider property or investments in multiple jurisdictions. This protects against country-specific crises. If the dollar collapses, but you hold assets in Switzerland or Singapore or Australia, you maintain wealth. If one country imposes capital controls, you have assets elsewhere. This isn't feasible for everyone. But if you have significant wealth, keeping it all in one country subject to one government's policies is concentration risk. Principle 7. Prepare for disruption, not just financial loss. Debt crises don't just destroy wealth, they disrupt society. Supply chains break, basic goods become scarce, social services fail, civil unrest increases. Having financial assets is important, but so is having physical preparedness. Food storage, water filtration, medical supplies, energy independence, security measures. This sounds extreme until you look at Venezuela, Lebanon, Sri Lanka, or any country that experienced economic collapse. It doesn't happen smoothly. It doesn't happen with warning. Systems that worked yesterday simply stop working. The people who prepared have options. Those who didn't are at the mercy of failing institutions. Now some will say this is paranoid, that modern developed countries with sophisticated financial systems won't experience these problems, that central banks and governments have tools to prevent crisis. Maybe, but that's a bet. You're betting that people who created the current debt problem will somehow solve it without consequences. You're betting that this time is different, that exponential debt growth can continue indefinitely despite all of history suggesting otherwise. That might be a bet you're comfortable making. But understand it's a bet, and if you're wrong, the consequences are severe. Others will say that even if crisis comes, individual preparation doesn't matter, that in a true collapse, nothing protects you, that we're all subject to systemic forces beyond individual control. There's truth to this. You can't completely insulate yourself from macroeconomic catastrophe, but you can improve your odds. You can be in the group that weathers the storm rather than the group that's destroyed by it. History shows that in every collapse, some people preserve wealth and emerge stronger. It's not random. It's the people who saw what was coming and prepared accordingly. The people who held real assets instead of financial promises. The people who had skills and relationships instead of just money. The people who were flexible and adaptable instead of rigid and complacent. You can't control what governments do. You can't stop the debt bubble from eventually popping. You can't prevent the consequences of decades of fiscal irresponsibility. But you can control your own decisions, your own preparation, your own positioning for what's coming. The debt trap exists at the societal level, but you don't have to be trapped individually. Understanding the system is the first step. Positioning yourself accordingly is the second. Most people won't do this. They'll trust the experts, they'll believe government assurances, they'll assume the system that worked in the past will work in the future. They'll be caught completely unprepared when crisis hits. Don't be most people. Let's talk about how this ends. Because it will end. Unsustainable trajectories don't continue indefinitely. They end suddenly, often catastrophically, and usually in ways no one expected. There are several possible endgames for the global debt crisis. None of them are good. The only question is which will happen first and where. Endgame 1. Default. The straightforward path. Government debt becomes so large relative to tax revenue that the government simply can't pay. They default. Bondholders lose money the government can no longer borrow. Spending must immediately match tax revenue. This has happened dozens of times in smaller countries. Argentina, as mentioned, has defaulted 9 times. Russia defaulted in 1998. Ecuador, Uruguay, Lebanon, Sri Lanka. The list is long. The consequences are severe but localized. The country defaulting faces economic depression, currency collapse, capital flight, political chaos. But the crisis doesn't necessarily spread globally because the defaulting country isn't systemically important. The problem is when a major economy defaults. If the US, Japan, or a large European country defaults, the global financial system collapses. Banks worldwide hold that debt as reserves and assets. Pension funds have invested in those bonds. Insurance companies rely on them. A default would trigger cascading failures throughout the global financial system. This is why major economies won't choose outright default if they have alternatives. The consequences are too catastrophic and too immediate. They'll choose slower forms of default instead. Endgame 2. Inflation. The slow-motion default. Instead of refusing to pay debts, the government pays them in currency that's worth less. They print money to make debt payments. The currency devalues. Creditors get paid nominally, but lose in real terms. This is the path most likely for major economies, because it's politically easier than outright default. Politicians can blame inflation on external factors, supply chain issues, energy prices, corporate greed, anything but their own money printing. And inflation happens gradually enough that people don't riot in the streets the way they would from sudden default. But if it goes too far, it becomes hyperinflation. The currency loses function as money. People stop accepting it. The economy reverts to barter or foreign currencies. Society breaks down as monetary exchange becomes impossible. Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, these are the templates. Government debt becomes unpayable. Government prints money to cover obligations. Currency dies. Economy collapses. Social order disintegrates. The US and Europe hope to avoid this through controlled inflation, high enough to erode debt burden, but low enough to maintain currency function. Whether they can thread this needle is the question. History suggests it's very difficult. Inflation tends to accelerate once started, and stopping it requires painful measures governments are reluctant to take. Endgame 3. Financial repression. This is the stealth option. Government uses regulatory power to force investors into government debt at below-market rates. Banks are required to hold government bonds. Pension funds face regulations that effectively mandate bond purchases. Interest rates are capped below inflation through central bank policy. The result is that savers are forced to lose purchasing power while funding government debt. It's a hidden tax that doesn't require legislation. Wealth is transferred from private savers to the government through negative real interest rates. This is already happening in Japan and Europe. It's starting in the US. It can continue for years, maybe decades, slowly grinding down private wealth to sustain government debt. The problem is, it creates zombie economies. Growth stagnates because capital is misallocated to government rather than productive private investment. Living standards decline slowly but steadily. Social cohesion erodes as younger generations realize they're being sacrificed to pay for past promises. This path avoids dramatic crisis, but leads to long-term decline. It's the Japanese scenario: decades of stagnation, aging population, declining relevance, slow decay, rather than sudden collapse. Endgame 4. Currency reset. This is the radical option. The current system is clearly unsustainable, so reset it. Introduce a new currency, potentially backed by gold or a basket of commodities. Existing debts are either defaulted on or converted to the new currency at disadvantageous rates for creditors. This happened after World War II with Bretton Woods. It happened in various forms during the transition from gold standard to fiat currency. It happened in countries that experienced hyperinflation and had to introduce new currencies. The process destroys existing wealth held in the old currency. Savings, pensions, bonds all lose value in the transition, but it allows a fresh start with a system that might be more sustainable. The challenge is coordination. A global currency reset would require unprecedented international cooperation. Individual countries resetting their own currencies face capital flight and trade difficulties. This is potentially where digital currencies, central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, become relevant. They provide a mechanism for governments to implement currency resets with more control. Every unit tracked digitally, negative interest rates easily implemented, capital controls built into the currency itself. This might be sold as modernization and convenience, but it's really about control. The ability to confiscate, freeze, or devalue holdings at will. The ability to prevent capital flight during a crisis. The ability to implement financial repression more effectively. Endgame 5. Controlled collapse. This is the scenario where governments and central banks recognize the system is unsustainable, but manage the unwinding to minimize chaos. Debts are partially written down in negotiated settlements. Currency values are allowed to adjust. Some banks and institutions fail, but in an orderly process. This requires political courage and international cooperation on an unprecedented scale. It requires accepting short-term pain for long-term sustainability. It requires admitting to populations that past promises can't be kept. It's possible in theory. In practice, political incentives make it nearly impossible. No politician wants to be responsible for the painful transition. Everyone hopes to postpone reckoning until after they're out of office. Most likely we'll see a combination of these endgames playing out differently in different countries. Some will inflate, some will default, some will reset currencies, some will muddle through financial repression for decades. But the common thread is that debts that can't be paid won't be paid. Either through outright default, inflation eroding value, or forced write-downs, creditors will lose. The only question is which creditors and through what mechanism. And here's what they're not telling you. You're one of the creditors. Every dollar you hold is a claim on the US economy. Every dollar in your bank account is a liability of the banking system. Every government bond in your portfolio is a promise to pay. When the system resets, those promises will be broken. Maybe slowly through inflation, maybe suddenly through default or currency change, but broken nonetheless. The people who understand this are preparing. The ultra-wealthy are buying hard assets, diversifying across jurisdictions, preparing for multiple scenarios. The politically connected are positioning themselves to profit from whatever transition occurs. Everyone else is being told everything is fine, that experts have everything under control, that the system is sustainable, that you should trust your savings to banks and your future to government promises. This is a lie, not a mistake, not an error, a deliberate lie told by people who know the truth but benefit from your ignorance. The debt trap isn't just about government borrowing. It's about creating a system where you have no choice but to participate in your own impoverishment, where saving destroys wealth, where working harder just means paying more taxes, where the rules are rigged so thoroughly that escape is nearly impossible. But nearly impossible isn't completely impossible. Some people will emerge from the coming transition with wealth intact or even enhanced. It won't be the people who followed conventional wisdom. It won't be the people who trusted institutional promises. It'll be the people who understood what was coming and positioned accordingly. The people who held real assets instead of financial promises. The people who maintained flexibility instead of rigid plans. The people who prepared for disruption instead of assuming continuity. The greatest wealth transfer in human history is coming. The question is, which side of that transfer will you be on? Will you be in the group that has wealth extracted through inflation, default, or confiscation? Or will you be in the group that preserved and positioned wealth to survive the transition? This isn't about getting rich. It's about not being impoverished by a system designed to fail. It's about protecting yourself and your family from the consequences of decades of fiscal irresponsibility you didn't cause and don't control. The debt trap is real. The end game is approaching, The timeline is uncertain, could be years, could be decades, but the direction is clear, and every day you wait, every day you trust the system, every day you follow conventional advice designed for a stable environment that no longer exists, you're moving closer to being trapped when the crisis hits. Rome didn't fall in a day. The denarius wasn't debased in a year, it took centuries. But each generation that participated in the decline, each emperor that debased the currency a little more, each citizen that accepted the fraud, they were all complicit in the eventual collapse. You're living through the same process, the debt growing every year, the money supply expanding every crisis, the promises being made that can't possibly be kept, the wealth being transferred from workers to the connected elite. Future historians will look back and wonder how it was so obvious yet so few prepared. They'll study the warning signs and marvel that populations didn't react. They'll analyze the propaganda and wonder how people believed such transparent lies. Don't be one of the people they wonder about. Be one of the people who saw clearly, understood deeply, and acted accordingly. This is The Money Upside Down. Subscribe, because the greatest theft in history is happening right now, and understanding it is your only defense. Next episode, Central Banks, the private institutions that control your money. We're going to expose exactly who owns the Federal Reserve, how they profit from your debt, and why they'll never let you escape the system. Until then, remember, debt that can't be paid won't be paid. The only question is how you'll be affected when that reality arrives. The countdown has begun.